Are you an Olympic caliber weightlifter? Do you take steroids? If the answer to the above two questions is yes, then proceed to the periodization methods that such athletes use in their training to ensure that their periods of heavy lifting coincide with their use of steroids. If you're not an Olympic caliber weightlifter and do not use steroids, then it should be patently obvious that this method does not apply to you. Let's look into the matter. The term overload has come to be regarded as synonymous with the amount of weight a muscle is made to contract against. The heavier the weight, the greater the muscular overload. However, as far back as 1956, it was demonstrated clinically that weight per se is only part, although a large part admittedly, of the hypertrophy equation. The other indispensable element in the muscle growth process is the amount of work your muscles are made to perform in a given unit of time. Properly defined, maximum overload is the greatest possible muscular output over a given unit of time. Research conducted by Ru Lang indicated only when a muscle performs with greatest power, i.e., through the overcoming of a greater resistance in a unit of time than before, will its functional cross-section need to increase. Hypertrophy is seen only in muscles that must perform a great amount of work in a unit of time. Further research by Pateau and Siebert put a finer point on the issue of overload. Hypertrophy results from an increase in the intensity of work done, increase of work in a unit of time, whereas the total amount of work done is without significance. These results are significant for a number of reasons, particularly for clean athletes, that is, natural trainees. First, they were obtained a full 10 years before testosterone was first isolated, so all of the subjects participating in the studies were unquestionably natural, that is, of normal human endocrinology. Today, in contrast, drug testing of experimental subjects represents a prohibitive and impractical cost for many universities. So not all conclusions obtained from current training research can be said to apply to natural bodybuilders. Further, the research conclusions just quoted demonstrate clinically that, for clean athletes, intensity of effort is the primary contributing factor to the process of muscle growth. Additional research conducted by Dr. Arthur Steinhaus indicates, no matter how much a muscle is used, it will not grow larger or stronger until it is overloaded. This means that the intensity of the work required of it must be increased above that to which it is currently accustomed, i.e., it must be required to exert more power, foot-pounds per minute, or work against greater resistance than before. The implications of such data are certainly startling in light of many current training trends. For instance, in the context of these results, the belief that natural bodybuilders need periodization, the factoring into one's workout schedule periods of lower muscular output, to stimulate muscle growth, doesn't ring true. In fact, these studies prove conclusively that muscle grows larger solely in proportion to the intensity or overload applied to it. The greater the intensity or overload, the greater the hypertrophic stimulus. Think about this for a moment. Once overload has been clearly isolated as the major stimulus that induces muscular hypertrophy, then it logically follows that a training method that provides the greatest overload will stimulate the greatest muscle growth. Much has been written by the new crop of fitness influencers recently about the importance of periodization, or cycling your workout routines throughout the course of a year. In fact, these same authors sell courses based on this concept. It is by no means a new concept, as periodization was the house system offered by Iron Man magazine during the 1990s. In those days, the periodization articles likened bodybuilding to architecture. They said you can't build a house without a blueprint, so you've got to map out your training plans accordingly. It was an interesting analogy, admittedly, although somewhat incongruous. After all, it would be an odd and infrequently employed architect indeed who would propose dividing up the construction of a house into seasons. Not to mention the fact that muscle cells are living organisms, not composed of pine and drywall, and therefore cannot be treated as such. As I said, it was an interesting analogy, just not a very practical one. As far as the concept of periodization itself is concerned, its advocates maintain that certain months of the year, or cycles, should be set aside for training with different weights, reps, and in some instances, goals, which its proponents tell you ahead of time are required for ultimate success. The truth, however, is that there exists no reason for periodization, particularly if you are a clean athlete, that is, one who doesn't use steroids. The concept of periodization was popularized by the Russian Olympic lifting coaches over 60 years ago in an attempt to synchronize the lifting of heavy weights with their lifters' drug cycles, hence the term cycling. When they were on steroids, they were stronger and able to train much harder and heavier than they were when they were off the drugs. As a result, periods of heavy lifting were structured to coincide with their drug cycles, and then periods of lighter, less intense lifting were introduced into the schedule to reduce the chance of burnout and injury as the athletes came off the drugs. When the Soviet lifters were winning titles, an American coach inquired about their training system and was told that they divided the routines up into periods of heavy lifting along with periods of not-so-heavy lifting. In a perfect textbook example of the fallacy post hoc ergo propter hoc, the U.S. coach assumed that because their success came after following this cycling system, it had to be the result of following the system. From this was born the entire periodization concept, complete with what one advocate at least described as a muscle refinement phase. If you really want for a day's work sometime, try to look up this term in any muscle physiology textbook. Why do I say this? Simply because it doesn't exist. You can do one of three things with muscle tissue: maintain its size, increase its size, which is hypertrophy, or decrease its size, which is atrophy. A trainee seeking to increase his muscle size must first train hard enough to stimulate growth and then rest long enough between workouts to allow that growth to manifest. It's as simple as that. After all, this isn't crude oil we're dealing with. It's muscle tissue, and therefore not subject to any process of refinement. Muscle has one function: it contracts. And when it contracts against resistance that is increased on a progressive basis, it grows bigger and stronger. Quite apart from the fact that the entire periodization concept is based on a misconception, is the fact that there's simply no evidence that engaging in activities that have been shown to have no effect on the process of muscle growth, such as training with light weights and reduced muscular output, will, if it's, quote, structured properly, close quote, somehow hasten the muscle growth process. And what if you're feeling strong as a bull when you head for the gym and know you're capable of really setting some personal best records that day? But alas, it's the refinement phase you happen to be in this month, not the maximum mass phase. Do you have to pull back on the throttle this workout? How would that result in anything except spinning your wheels and reduced progress? The clinical formula for muscle growth is increased work overload over a unit of time, or increased intensity. Anything other than this will not maximally stimulate your muscles to grow bigger and stronger, period. Certain advocates of periodization claim that the trainee, by training less intensely, is engaged in what they call active rest, which is really an oxymoron, particularly when what is really required is simply rest. If one has applied the proper stimulus, then one's body needs to be undisturbed long enough to produce an adaptive response, which is difficult at the best of times. If you go to a grocery store and look at 1 pound of ground beef, and consider the fact that you're asking your body to produce that amount of tissue almost out of thin air, you are better able to realize that in order for your body to accomplish this, it will need to be undisturbed for a period of time just to be able to do it. But if you keep throwing in workouts of varying degrees of intensity, the so-called active rest periods, you're really just interfering with your body's ability to produce such an adaptive response. The workout, remember, is what stimulates your muscles to grow larger, and a specific stimulus is required for this. But the growth takes place during the rest period in between workouts, which can vary from as little as 24 hours for those who have a high tolerance to intense training, to 4, 6, or more days in between for those who have a low tolerance to intense training. Strategically predetermining certain months in which to reduce the intensity of your workouts and perform higher reps, alternated with periods of moderate intensity with moderate reps, or any other such reduction of muscular output, is an absolute waste of time as far as stimulating maximum increases in size and strength are concerned.
For optimal results, the single most important factor is intensity of effort. The results you realize will be totally dependent on the energy you put forth.
Knowing these facts regarding the requirements for muscle growth, there is absolutely no excuse for the serious trainee to train with less than all-out effort each and every workout. As described earlier, periodization got its start when Soviet bloc Olympic coaches began the use of steroids for their athletes. The human body cannot withstand the massive doses of the drugs on a continual basis, so training intensity was reduced during the periods of no drug use and increased during periods of heavy drug use. This cycling of intensity was erroneously taken as the reason for the great strength increases. The truth is that it was the drugs that had to be cycled, not the training intensity. Let's give the final word on the matter to Mike Mentzer. Once the fundamental principles are understood, the issue of progressively decreasing the volume, and especially the frequency, becomes the most pressing issue. If the bodybuilder bears this in mind, he will never reach a sticking point. There will be no need to engage in such protocols as periodization, wherein you train efficiently, i.e. intensely, for certain periods of time, and then train inefficiently, i.e. with less intensity for other periods, and he will actualize his muscular potential in a relatively short time.